I am concerned that recent violence around our nation is giving some in our communities a justification for fear, hatred, and violence. I am reminded that true and lasting change does not come from violence, but from exercising our voices and our votes.
The race to equity continues this morning on For the Record. Good morning, I'm Neil Heinen. So where do we go from here? It's a question many are asking in the wake of District Attorney Ishmael Ozan's decision in the killing of Tony Robinson. Many of us are still struggling with the implications of that decision, and many more are working to ensure that the decision and our response to it are, in the words of Urban League of Greater Madison CEO Dr. Ruben Anthony, a catalyst for permanent change. Which brings us back to the racial disparities in Madison and the race to equity. I want to thank Keitra Burnett of the United Way of Dane County for helping put together this morning's show. And I welcome to For the Record Gloria Ladson-Billings, president of the local chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, Greg Jones, president of the NAACP Dane County, and Bishop Harold Rayford, president of the African American Council of Churches. And thank you all very much for joining me this morning.
You're welcome.
Our pleasure.
I really would like to start just with your personal reflections on where we stand at the end of this week in the wake of the district attorney's decision, Greg.
Well, generally, my thoughts are, one, there's been an awakening and an awareness. And that awakening started a few years back, I believe, and it told the community we need to be much more aware and conscious of some of the disparities that exist. I think Dr. G opened our eyes. Other developments have continued to widen our eyes, and we now have them fully open and are moving to a more positive place for our community.
So how do we think through, Gloria, this week's activities, the fact of the death of Tony Robinson, the fact of the district attorney's decision and how we have to come to grips with that in the context of these last couple of years?
So, I mean, I would agree with Greg that we've had this kind of awakening, but I also think it's really important to understand that we're in a larger context of disparity. Madison, Dane County is not an anomaly. We are in the context of things that have happened in Ferguson, Missouri, the things that have happened in New York City, things that have happened in Cleveland, and more recently in Baltimore. And I think we were in some ways trying to convince ourselves that we were somehow so very different from those places. Different maybe on scale, but that the whole issue of disparity has been there all along. And I do want to really salute the young people who organized around Young, Gifted, and Black, because they brought this up last summer. They didn't just mobilize around Tony Robinson. They've been out there trying to help us understand the ways in which their frustration as young people is really kind of starting to bubble over. And fortunately, most of their responses have been peaceful, and they have been within the law.
I very much want to come back to this role of young people in this conversation, because I think it's very, very important. But I'd like to get your thoughts, Bishop, on maybe even the last 2 months in the context of what Gloria and Greg were just talking about.
You know, I couldn't agree with them more. What has happened over the last couple of months, I think, has caused Dane County to realize that these issues are real, and it has been easy to say, well, you know, look at what's going on over there or in that city, and they really ought to get it together, or to question the authenticity of the Race to Equity report. But now we see with our own eyes that the pain is real, the feelings are real, the disparities really do exist, and they exist right here in our own backyard.
There is a clear interest on some to continue to dissect the shooting of Tony Robinson and all of the particulars of that case And it's fueling a lot of unhappiness and a lot of the protests, and I think that will continue to do so. But how do we incorporate that? As Gloria mentioned, this is a national problem. The relationship between law enforcement and the African American community is a national problem, and there's a fundamental issue there. How can we incorporate Tony Robinson's death into how we move forward on these issues?
I think that one thing we have to do is to remember that Tony was a person. He was a young man. He had a family. He was a member of our community. And when when there are tragedies that happen in other cities where people live that we don't know them, but we're one step away in our community from someone that's directly connected to Tony or one of his teachers or one of his friends. So again, it causes his death, his shooting, to be a real thing that we cannot ignore.
I think, Neil, one of the things that is driving your question and should be known is there's been a collection and collaboration of many, many different entities in the community. I reflect on the United Way's Law Enforcement Communities of Colors group that began to meet right after Ferguson, and they began to ask themselves, how do we look and how do we compare to what we see in Ferguson? That group includes community-based civic leaders, law enforcement leaders, chiefs of police, and they have sat around the table. After Tony's shooting and death, they began to shift gears and begin to look at Madison in light of that event. So I think what you've got is many, many different people from various backgrounds saying, we need to look at ourselves and our own institutional practices and go forward. And lastly, on that note, for me, what's really driving some of the change is the Black Leadership Council. When it decided we want to fundamentally look at structures and systems and identify those points of intersection where we can have some influence, that is a real interesting approach to providing more information and to the discourse. And I think what I believe to the question is the opportunity is there, the resources are there, the passion and commitment's there. What's going to deliver that level of change that we need is going to be the ongoing involvement and engagement. I've been talking in the NAACP. One of the fundamental tenets that we must put in place, driven from Martin Luther King, is engagement and offering all kinds of opportunities for various kinds of engagement. That's where I think we can certainly invoke some change.
I agree. Those two groups, the African American churches, the Justified Anger group, there does seem to be a very active coalition of groups working on this. When we come back, though, I want to return to the students and the young people and talk about their engagement.
Sure.
And we'll do that right after this. I am back talking this morning about the race to equity, which is the broader picture in which we consider the events of this past week, the decision of the district attorney and the death of Tony Robinson. Greg Jones, the president of the NAACP of Dane County, is with me. Gloria Latson-Billings, who is here as the president of the local chapter of a very prominent sorority in this country, and Bishop Harold Rayford joins me as well. And it was you that mentioned the students, appropriately so, Gloria, but their role in all of this is adding an energy, it's adding attention as well. I mean, because the schools are involved and parents are involved in a different level. And I think a large population in this county, and I'm going to just say 60-year-old white people, to you know, as a descriptor, are looking at these young people with some trepidation.
No doubt.
And yet this role is significant.
I would say it's very significant for a couple of reasons. Number one of the important civic lessons we can learn as individual democratic citizens is the right to engage in civil disobedience. What I'm impressed with is that they took it a step further and provided training, offered those young individuals the concept, what it meant, how you engage in it. And then secondly, I think that what I like about this group is that the compassion, commitment, and continuity that they have described issues that they believe are exclusive and marginalizing the African American community in some level, and they have grabbed it and put hold to it. Now what we want to do is take that energy and passion and produce social change.
How is this showing up in the parishes, in the faith community, Bishop? How is that intersection with young people and this social activism present itself?
You know, when you look at Young, Gifted, and Black, those are our children.
Yeah.
They came out of our churches. They are our nephews, our nieces. And the pain and the passion that you see and hear from them has forced a dialogue. They've forced people to really study the issues and understand, okay, what is this all about? So the group that you talked about that is concerned about Young, Gifted, and Black are now wanting to talk about issues that they probably would not be prepared to address had Young, Gifted, and Black not been so adamant in making sure that these issues are not swept under the rug. And I think one of the challenges we face, having come through the decision, is not to go back to normal. Not to take the victory lap and say, hey, we've done our part. The protests were peaceful, now let's go back to doing business as usual. I think that is a terrible mistake. And now that we are having meaningful conversations, now that the Black Leadership Council has been formed and we're looking at these issues together, we owe Young, Gifted, and Black an appreciation for forcing the dialogue as they have.
You know what struck me, Gloria, it was this conversation about avoiding arrest. You know, there's a time when arrest for civil disobedience was a badge of honor.
Right. Sure.
And particular white protesters would have accepted it, sought it out. Right. And yet we're talking about it in terms which I think speak right to the disparities. Right. That an arrest of a young person now affects the rest of their life.
Right. And I want to go back to something you said earlier about people saying we shouldn't be talking about this or engaging in this. Democracies don't survive without its citizens talking. The same people who don't want to talk about this incident don't want to talk about race. There's this sense that, oh, this conversation is over. It is not over. My passion for what's happening is linked to the fact that on April 4th, 1968, I was in Baltimore. The death of Dr. King, I was in Baltimore, and I saw the city explode. And I also saw a city that has not responded. So what has happened is we haven't had enough talk. And you have this bottled up frustration that people are now willing to come out and say some things. Your issue around the arrest, when I was protesting as a young person, when you got arrested, your parents came and got you and you left. Yeah. Yeah. Now you're in the system. They may take your DNA. And so next thing that might happen is you may get a traffic citation. You show up in a record in ways that are not healthy for you and that may lead to another misunderstanding that ends up with another young person hurt or, you know, God forbid, dead. So we have to be a lot more careful about ensuring that our youngsters don't end up, and our young people don't end up in the system at all.
I always want to be careful about asking anybody to speak for an entire community, but maybe for the organizations that you represent, you can tell me, how will the city's decision to proceed with a review of law enforcement policies be received? Will that be received as a positive step?
So, well, certainly it would for the NAACP, because the criminal justice pillar for the NAACP has always been about opportunities to invoke change and certainly eliminate disparities and discriminatory practices within that system. I think, Neil, we've got to go further. It's one thing to look at the system of criminal justice and look at those particular points, but I think the judges play a role. They dispense the sentencing, the prosecutors, as well as the public defenders or defense attorneys. In the case of prosecutors, I really want to have a real close look at how that prosecutorial system and prosecutorial discretion is at play when sentences are handed out. We know the data. It talks about the use of marijuana not being very much different between black youth and white youth, but the sentencing outcomes are certainly different. That tells me that that's one of the structural, systematic issues that we need to look at and understand how it's being played out and then address it. That's why I'm so glad when this Black Leadership Council said, we want to look at systems and structures and look at those practices that are exclusionary, marginalizing, and then go forward with some type of recommendation. So I think you're on target.
I want to look at some of the other disparities and talk about what we will look for as we move forward to know we're making progress. Let's take our last break, and we'll do that right after this.
You know, Senator.
I am back with Greg Jones, Gloria Letson Billings, and Bishop Harold Rayford. And Bishop, I didn't give you a chance to respond to the issue of the review of law enforcement practices and your thoughts about that.
There's a strong sense of distrust in the African American community, and there's no excitement about this review. We can review something, but if no changes result from that review, then nothing has been accomplished. So I think, as Greg mentioned, we have to go a step further with the review, and there has to be a commitment from all parties involved to implement some changes that will address the disparities that we see, some changes that will improve race relations between law enforcement and the African American and other communities. We are on part of a task force that was assembled by the United Way. And the target of that task force was to look at race relations between law enforcement and the minority communities. And as a subgroup of that, we are looking directly at the use of force and the use of force continuum. Again, this is another review. And talk, as we say, is cheap. So within the African American community, we've seen reviews before. We've seen task forces before. We've seen group studies before. But what we haven't seen and what we must see are positive results to come out of those task forces.
I know I really struggle with that because it's the talk versus action tension that exists, and I hear enough talk, and yet, as you said, Gloria, and I believe that there's still an appetite for talk. People want to continue the conversation, but maybe it can't be instead of action, right? I mean,
and that's the criticism of Young, Gifted, and Black. Right. The criticism of Young, Gifted, and Black to us is you talk too much. That's all you do is talk, and nothing ever changes. And
legitimate. I mean, I think we're all wrestling with that. So this past week, the Urban League co-sponsored the Economic Development and Diversity Summit. I thought I heard a different type of language being used than previous summits, and a greater willingness to address the disparities. They were central to what was going on, that the business community can't thrive with a workforce that's not diverse.
And I think what you see, Neil, is when we take on the struggle of others and make a commitment that those struggles are our struggles, and that the change needed to make their lives better is a commonplace action from the business community, the corporate America, or corporate Madison, the social service, and the educational institution. Until we can walk in the shoes of those people who are living the lives of the disparities, it won't change. What I'm saying to you today is that the commitment from around the table of the Black Leadership Council, they took off their shoulder pads, they put on their helmets and said, if we're going to get into this game, it's us. And the other thing I want to leave you with when I talked about the continuum of awareness and awakening is simply this. I believe that there's a sense among African Americans themselves, who are CEOs and program managers, who all have talent and skills, are saying to themselves and to the community, it is now time. We hear our children, we see the pain, we know the issues. We now must say, we have to get involved and make some changes. Take action.
Tamara Grigsby from Joe Parisi's office said to the group in her breakout session that the county executive's proposals on fines for marijuana use, on driver's education and making driver's education free and available to all, that these are the types of action steps, I think, that will result in fewer disparities. Is it fair to say that?
I would agree with that, and I would take it one step further. The county executive is speaking for the entire county. That gives that access to opportunity initiative more momentum across the county. The real issue is going to be, in my opinion, residents in those individual municipalities, regardless of race, creed, or color, will now have to say, this is needed to produce a much better county.
Right.
And we'll get engaged in that particular, because I think one of the things that I see happening with that particular initiative is it's going to open up the eyes and opportunity, the disparities that have been caused by the lack of these kind of opportunities, leading to more distress among our citizens. But I'll tell you, as a final note, the fundamental thing that needs to change in our county is a much clearer approach to mass poverty.
Right.
We have created a situation, I'm saying that collectively, those of us who haven't been advocating as loudly and as strongly as we can, and those who've kind of benefited from it, we must address that and begin to move forward in the other areas.
We just have a minute and a half left,
Sure.
Lori. But can you connect this to education for us
So
in the
I was
gap?
going to say the place where I enter the conversation is always around education.
Right.
If our kids are not well educated, then they have much fewer opportunities than their peers. We have to do something about expelling and suspending kids, which I know the school district and Superintendent Cheatham is working on. We have to make sure that our kids get access to high quality instruction, honors, advanced placement, those kinds of courses and opportunities that put them on the road, starting from early education, early childhood education. We don't have enough access to early childhood education in our community, through college. So we have got to see education as the lever it is designed to be in a democratic society.
Are we taking steps in that direction here in Madison? Do you feel like we are?
I think we are. I think there are a couple things happening, not only the superintendent's agenda, but I serve as the co-convener for the Working Group on Education for the Justified Anger Coalition. And we are looking very carefully at what we call the transitions, the ways in which kids maneuver from one institution to the next.
Thank you all very much for joining me. I appreciate it. We're going to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. My thanks to my guests this morning, and thanks to you for joining us on For the Record. We'll see you next Sunday.